In suburban Minneapolis, a 72-year-old retired businesswoman was about to shatter decades of family tradition. What started as a dinner invitation took a shocking turn when she faced her son's desperate $100,000 demand. Josephine David wasn't your typical enabling mother. For 40 years, she had dominated male boardrooms, known for razor-sharp business instincts. When Michael pleaded for divorce money, she had no idea she was walking into family warfare. Josephine made a decision that would lead to social exile and emotional devastation. What began as expected maternal rescue became a brutal awakening about love versus enabling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Josephine David heard the familiar sound of a car door slamming in her driveway and felt her stomach tighten before she even saw who it was. Through the kitchen window of her Edina home, she watched Michael emerge from his BMW, the one she'd helped him purchase 2 years ago when his consulting business had temporarily struggled. He moved with that particular swagger he'd perfected over the years, the one that said he owned whatever space he entered, regardless of whose name was on the deed. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel, noting how the late afternoon sun caught the silver in her hair reflected in the window. At 72 years old, she still felt that familiar flutter of maternal anxiety whenever her son appeared unannounced. Some things, it seemed, never changed. "Mom." Michael's voice carried through the house as he let himself in through the front door. "Nonak, nocheshetashchen." He'd kept a key since his divorce from his first wife, Sarah, 15 years ago, another temporary arrangement that had somehow become permanent. In the kitchen, she called back, straightening her shoulders. The movement was automatic, a remnant from her decades in the financial advisory business, when she'd learned to project confidence, even when clients brought her their most desperate situations. Michael appeared in the doorway, all 6 feet of him filling the frame. At 46, he still possessed the kind of easy charm that had gotten him through prep school, college, and into the hearts of 2 women who'd eventually learned to see past it. His smile was bright, genuine seeming, but Josephine had learned to read the subtle tension around his eyes. "You look beautiful," he said, crossing to kiss her cheek. The compliment felt rehearsed, though she knew he probably meant it. "I was in the neighborhood, and thought I'd stop by. Haven't seen you in weeks." 3 weeks to be exact. She'd been counting, though she wouldn't admit it. "You know, you're always welcome," she said. Though something in his posture, the way he glanced around the kitchen, cataloging and assessing, made her add, "Though a call would have been nice." Spontaneity, Mom. Life's too short for constant planning. He opened the refrigerator as if he lived there, peering inside with the casual entitlement that had once seemed charming when he was 12. Now it made her chest feel tight. "What's for dinner?" "I'm starvin'." The assumption irritated her more than it should have. "I wasn't planning on cooking tonight. Margaretchen invited me to try that new Thai place on France Avenue." "Cancel it." Michael's tone was light, but there was something underneath it that made Josephine pause. "I need to talk to you about something important. Besides, when was the last time we had a real meal together? Just the 2 of us." She found herself nodding, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the way he'd said important. Or maybe it was the guilt that always seemed to surface when he suggested she was prioritizing others over him. "I suppose I could make that chicken you like." "Perfect." His smile brightened, and for a moment, he looked like the boy who used to help her in this same kitchen, standing on a step stool to reach the counter. "I'll open some wine. You still have that Chardonnay I brought last time?" The wine he brought from her own cellar? She remembered, though she didn't correct him. An hour later, they sat across from each other at the dining room table she'd bought after Robert died. The chandelier cast warm light over the meal she'd prepared: roasted chicken with herbs, garlic, mashed potatoes, and green beans almondine. Michael's favorites, the same dishes she'd made for his birthdays throughout his childhood. "This is incredible," he said, cutting into his chicken with the precise movements of someone who'd attended etiquette classes at her insistence. Amanda never cooked like this. The mention of his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, she reminded herself, hung in the air between them. Josephine set down her fork. How are things with Amanda? You mentioned on the phone last month that you were working through some difficulties. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. He reached for his wine glass, taking a sip that was longer than necessary. She filed for divorce last week. The words landed with the weight of stones in still water. Josephine felt the familiar sensation she'd experienced too many times over the years, the dropping sensation in her stomach that preceded her son's revelations of crisis. Failure need, she thought. I'm sorry, she said carefully. I know you hope counseling might help. We went twice. Michael's voice carried a bitter edge. She wasn't really committed to saving the marriage. Turns out she'd already consulted with lawyers before we started. Josephine studied her son's face. In the soft light, she could see the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. The slight softness around his jaw spoke to too many business lunches and not enough genuine work. What does her filing mean? Practically speaking, she wants everything. Michael's fork clattered against his plate. The house, half my business assets, alimony. Her lawyer is asking for $75,000 in attorney fees alone, just to start the process. There it was, the number that would justify whatever came next. Josephine felt something cold settle in her chest, a familiar recognition that made her want to stand up and walk away from the table. That seems excessive, she said instead. She hired Patterson Williams and Associates. They specialize in high net worth divorces. Michael leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone she remembered from his teenage years when he'd wanted something. They're ruthless, Mom. They'll drag this out for months, maybe years, trying to bleed me dry. And what does your attorney say? Michael looked down at his plate. I haven't retained one yet. The good ones want $50,000 upfront minimum. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken understanding. Josephine felt as if she were watching a scene she'd acted in many times before, though the stakes kept getting higher with each performance. Michael, she said slowly, are you asking me to? I need help, Mom. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back all evening. I can't fight this alone. Amanda's family has money, connections. Without proper representation, I'll lose everything. Everything. She'd heard that word from him before, when his first business had failed, when Sarah had left him, when his second startup had collapsed after 6 months. Each time, everything had meant everything except what Mom could provide. Have you looked into less expensive attorneys, legal aid, payment plans? Michael's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features as if he'd never considered that she might not immediately agree to help. Legal aid is for poor people, Mom. And payment plans. He shook his head. The good lawyers don't work that way. They know that divorce cases can drag on. They want their money up front. So, you're asking me to pay your legal fees? I'm asking my mother to help me through the worst crisis of my life. His voice carried a note of hurt that she recognized as carefully calculated. I've never asked you for anything I didn't absolutely need. The statement was so patently false that Josephine felt something shift inside her chest. The BMW in her driveway, the seed money for 2 failed businesses, the down payment on the condo he'd lost in his first divorce, the loan for his European vacation with Amanda 2 years ago that had never been repaid. How much would you need? She heard herself ask, though part of her mind was screaming at her to stop. $75,000 to start. Maybe another $25,000 if things get complicated. He said it casually, as if he were asking for $20 for lunch. $100,000, nearly a fifth of her annual retirement income, money she'd spent 4 decades accumulating dollar by careful dollar in an industry that had barely tolerated women when she'd started. Michael, that's a significant amount of money. It's a drop in the bucket for you. His tone had shifted again, becoming more confident. Your portfolio is worth what, $3 million? 4? This is my life we're talking about. The casual assessment of her wealth, as if it belonged to him by right rather than to her by decades of sacrifice, made something snap to attention in her mind. She thought of the years she'd worked 60-hour weeks while raising him alone after his father left. The clients she'd cultivated, the trust she'd built, the reputation she'd earned when women in finance were seen as novelties at best. "I need to think about it," she said. Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Think about it? It's a substantial sum, Michael. I need to consider the implications for my own financial security." "Your financial security?" He set down his fork entirely now, his voice rising slightly. "Mom, you're 72 years old. What exactly are you saving money for?" The question hit her like a physical blow, as if her own needs, her own future, were irrelevant now that she'd reached an age where her primary purpose should be facilitating his comfort. "I'm saving it for my retirement, for potential health care costs, for the life I've worked 40 years to secure." Her voice was steady, but she could feel her pulse quickening. "You're retired. You've been retired for 7 years, and your health is fine." Michael leaned back in his chair, studying her with a look she'd seen him use in business meetings. Analytical, slightly predatory. "Besides, what's the point of having money if you won't use it to help your family when they need it most? There's a difference between helping and enabling." The words slipped out before she could stop them, drawn from some deep well of frustration she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Michael's expression went very still. "Enabling."
His voice was quiet now.
"Dangerous. Is that what you think I'm doing? Coming to my mother for help in a crisis? I think you're 46 years old, and you've never handled a major financial crisis without asking me to solve it for you." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Michael stared at her as if she'd slapped him, his face cycling through surprise, hurt, and something harder. "I see." He pushed back from the table, standing slowly. "So when your son is facing financial ruin, your response is to lecture him about independence. My response is to suggest that maybe it's time you found your own solutions." "My own solutions?" He repeated the words as if tasting something bitter.
"Right."
"Well, I can see where we stand." He moved toward the hallway, then stopped, looking back at her. "You know, Amanda was right about one thing. She said you'd never really let me grow up because it gave you too much control. I defended you, but maybe I was wrong." The accusation stung more than it should have, partly because she wondered if there might be truth in it. "Michael, no, it's fine. I understand." His voice had gone cold. "Professional. I'll figure something out. I always do, right? The independent son you apparently want me to be." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her sitting alone at the table with 2 half-finished plates and the lingering scent of his cologne. She heard the front door close, the BMW's engine start, the sound of gravel under tires as he backed out of her driveway. Josephine sat in the sudden quiet of her house, staring at the dining room that had hosted so many family meals, so many conversations, so many moments of connection and conflict. The chandelier cast the same warm light, but something felt different now. Broken, maybe. Or maybe just changed. She thought about Amanda's words filtered through Michael's hurt and anger. Was that what she'd been doing all these years, keeping him dependent to keep him close? Or was she finally at 72 learning the difference between love and obligation? The question would follow her through the long night ahead, along with the echo of her son's voice and the weight of a choice she wasn't sure she was brave enough to make: the price of independence. Josephine's hallway chimed 3 times, its deep bronze notes echoing through the house like a funeral bell. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, where shadows from the streetlight outside created shifting patterns that reminded her of storm clouds. Sleep had abandoned her entirely, leaving her mind to replay every moment of dinner, every word exchanged, every expression that had crossed Michael's face. "What exactly are you saving money for?" The question circled in her thoughts like a vulture, picking at wounds she'd tried to keep buried. At 72, what was she saving for? The rational part of her mind, the part that had built a successful business from nothing, knew the answer: healthcare costs that could consume a lifetime of savings in months. The dignity of aging in her own home rather than becoming a burden. The security that came from never having to depend on anyone else, especially not the son who saw her wealth as his inheritance. But another part of her, the part that had carried him for 9 months and worried through every fever, every heartbreak, every failure, whispered that maybe he was right. Maybe she was being selfish. Maybe this was what mothers did. sacrifice their own security for their children's immediate needs. She rolled over, reaching for the bedside lamp. The sudden brightness made her squint, but she needed to see clearly, to think without the distorting shadows of doubt. Her financial portfolio lay in the drawer of her nightstand, not because she was paranoid, but because she'd learned long ago that knowledge was power, and power required constant vigilance. The numbers stared back at her in neat columns, 3.2 million in various investments. The house worth another 800,000. Her retirement accounts carefully constructed over decades of 15% contributions when most people saved 5. It looked like wealth, and by most standards it was. But she also knew how quickly it could disappear. Robert's final months had taught her that lesson with brutal clarity. The experimental treatments not covered by insurance, the private nurses, the modifications to make the house wheelchair accessible. $47,000 in 6 months. Money she'd spent without hesitation because she'd loved him and because she could afford it then. Now, at 72, she was 5 years older, 5 years closer to potentially needing that same level of care herself. Michael saw surplus. She saw survival. The phone rang at 7:30, just as she was pouring her second cup of coffee. The caller ID showed Michael's number, and she felt her stomach clench with the same anxiety she'd experienced as a young mother waiting for him to come home past curfew. Mom. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less certain than it had the night before. I've been thinking about our conversation. So have I. She settled into the kitchen chair where she'd sat through so many of these calls over the years, each one following the same pattern: crisis, demand, her eventual capitulation. Look, I know I probably came on too strong last night. I was stressed, scared about the divorce, but the situation hasn't changed. I really do need help here. The vulnerability in his voice tugged at something deep in her chest. This was the Michael she remembered from childhood. The little boy who'd run to her when he scraped his knee, who'd cried in her arms when his father left. But that little boy was now a 46-year-old man who'd never learned to tend his own wounds. Michael, before we talk about money, I need to ask you something. She'd rehearsed this question through the sleepless hours, knowing it was important to understand before she made any decision. What happened with Amanda? Did it really happen? Not the version where she's the villain and you're the victim. Silence stretched between them long enough that she wondered if he'd hung up. What do you mean? His tone had shifted, becoming defensive. I mean that marriages don't end overnight. There were problems before she filed for divorce. What were they? Mom, I don't see how rehashing the details of my marriage helps with the immediate crisis. It helps me understand whether this is truly an emergency or the consequence of choices you made. Her voice was gentle but firm, drawing on decades of experience with clients who tried to deflect uncomfortable questions about their financial disasters. Another pause, shorter this time, filled with the sound of his breathing. She said, I was too dependent on you. The words came out in a rush, as if he couldn't bear to hold them. She said, I used you as a crutch instead of building my own stability. We fought about it constantly, especially after you helped with the condo down payment. The admission hit Josephine like cold water. Amanda had seen what she'd been too loving or too guilty to recognize. And what did you say when she brought this up? I defended our relationship. I said she didn't understand that family helps family, that you wanted to help because you loved me. His voice cracked slightly, but she said that wasn't love. A lot of it was control, that you kept me dependent so I'd never really leave.
Control.
There was that word again, the one that had kept her awake all night. She thought about the young woman she'd been when she'd started her business, hungry, determined, terrified of depending on anyone else after her husband had left her to raise Michael alone. Had she somehow, in trying to give her son everything she'd never had, created the very dependency she'd fought so hard to avoid in her own life? Michael, do you think Amanda was right? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. She could almost hear him thinking, weighing his answer against what he needed from her. I think Amanda came from money and never understood what it was like to struggle. She never understood that accepting help from family isn't weakness, it's smart. His voice was gaining strength now, conviction. Besides, it's not like I've never paid you back. But he hadn't.
Not really.
Oh, there had been token payments here and there, usually accompanied by explanations about cash flow problems or delayed receivables. The pattern was always the same: crisis, rescue, promises, and then gradual forgetting until the next crisis arrived. Michael, in the 25 years since you graduated college, how much money have I given or loaned you? Mom, I don't keep a running tally.
Ido.
She pulled out a folder she'd compiled during the long night hours, her accountant's mind having organized decades of financial records. $267,000. That includes business investments that failed, loans that were never repaid, and direct gifts for emergencies. The silence this time was profound, stretching so long. She wondered if the connection had been lost. You kept track? His voice was barely above a whisper. I keep track of all my financial transactions. It's what allowed me to build the security I have. She softened her tone, trying to take the sting out of the numbers. I'm not throwing this in your face, sweetheart. I'm trying to understand a pattern. A pattern. He repeated the words with growing anger. So, helping your son makes me some kind of charity case? It makes you someone who's never had to develop your own financial resilience because you've always known I was there as a safety net. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with a mother helping her son? Nothing, if it actually helps. But Michael, you're 46 years old, and you're in the same position you were in at 26, facing a crisis and expecting me to solve it. How is that helping you grow?
I don't need to grow, Mom.
I need a lawyer. The bluntness of his statement crystallized something that had been forming in her mind all night. This wasn't about the divorce. Not really. This was about a fundamental difference in how they saw their relationship, their responsibilities, their futures. She thought about Dr. Marcus Williams, her old business partner, and the difficult decision he'd made 5 years ago when his son had asked for money to avoid bankruptcy. Marcus had said no, and his son had lost his business, his house, his pride. But 18 months later, that same son had started over, built something smaller but sustainable, and was now thriving in ways he never had when he could rely on his father's wealth. Michael, I've made my decision. The words felt like stepping off a cliff, but she forced herself to continue. I'm not going to pay for your divorce. The silence that followed was different from the others. Deeper, more shocked, as if he couldn't quite process what he'd heard.
What?
I said, no, I'm not going to pay your legal fees. You're not. His voice cracked. Mom, you can't be serious. This is my life we're talking about, my future. It is your life, and that's exactly why you need to handle it yourself. I can't handle it myself. The words exploded from him with raw panic. Do you understand what will happen if I don't get proper representation? Amanda will take everything. The house, the business, everything I've worked for. Then maybe it's time to ask yourself why you're in a position where one crisis can destroy everything you've worked for. Because I trusted the wrong person. Because I married someone who turned out to be greedy and vindictive, or because you've never built real financial stability, because you've always known you could fall back on me. That's not, he stopped, breathing hard. You're really going to do this? You're really going to abandon me when I need you most? The word abandon hit her like a physical blow. It was the same word he'd used when his father left, the same fear that had driven her to overcompensate for years to prove that she would never leave him the way his father had. I'm not abandoning you. I'm refusing to enable you. Enable? His voice was bitter now, angry. You sound like Amanda. Next, you'll be telling me I need therapy. Maybe you do. Maybe we both do.
I don't need therapy, Mom.
I need money. I need my mother to help me through the worst crisis of my life. The way mothers are supposed to help their children. The way mothers are supposed to help is by raising children who can handle crises themselves. I'm 46 years old. It's a little late for parenting lessons.
Is it?
Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like I never stopped being your parent. And you never stopped being my dependent child. The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown. She could hear him breathing. Could almost feel his shock and anger through the phone line. You know what? His voice had gone cold. The warmth and vulnerability completely gone. Amanda was right about you. You do want to control me. You want to keep me struggling, so I'll always need you. And the minute I actually ask for help, you pull it away.
Michael, no.
I get it now. This isn't about enabling or tough love, or any of the psychological jargon you're spouting. This is about you punishing me for not being the perfect son who never needs anything from you. That's not true. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Isn't it? You've spent my whole life making me feel guilty for needing help. And now when I really need it, you're using it as some kind of weapon to prove how independent and strong you are. Each word felt like a slap, precisely aimed at her deepest fears about herself, her parenting, her motivations. She could feel tears starting, but she forced her voice to remain steady. I love you, Michael. That's why I'm saying no. If this is love, then I don't want it. His voice was shaking now with anger or tears or both. If this is what I can expect from my mother when my world is falling apart, then maybe Amanda was right about that too. Maybe I'm better off without family who won't be there when I need them. You're upset. I'm done. The words were final. Absolute. I'm done asking you for help. I'm done trying to have a relationship with someone who sees me as a project to be fixed instead of a son to be loved. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't try to explain yourself. I'll figure out my own life from now on, just like you want. Michael, please. But the line was already dead, leaving her sitting in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and the echo of his words reverberating through the sudden silence. She set the phone down with shaking hands and stared at the coffee cup that had gone cold during their conversation. Outside, the morning sun was painting her garden in shades of gold. The same garden where she'd taught Michael to plant tomatoes when he was 8, where they'd picked raspberries together every summer until he'd grown too old and too cool for such simple pleasures. Had she just saved her son from a life of dependency? Or had she destroyed the relationship that mattered most to her? Had she shown him tough love? Or had she proven that Amanda was right about her need for control? The questions would follow her through the days ahead, along with the memory of the pain in Michael's voice and the terrible fear that she might have chosen principle over love, independence over family, and in doing so lost the most important thing in her life. But for now, she sat in her kitchen and cried for the little boy who used to run to her with his problems, and for the man who might never do so again. 2 weeks passed in a silence so complete that Josephine found herself checking her phone obsessively, hoping for a text, a missed call, any sign that Michael's anger had cooled enough for conversation. The quiet felt unnatural in a house that had been the center of family gatherings for over 30 years, where holidays and birthdays had filled these rooms with laughter and arguments and the comfortable chaos of people who belonged to each other. She tried to maintain her routines: morning coffee while reading the Star Tribune, afternoon walks around Lake Harriet, and bridge club on Thursdays. But everything felt hollow, performed rather than lived. Even Margaret Chen, her neighbor and closest friend, had noticed her distraction during their Tuesday lunch at the country club. "You seem miles away, dear," Margaret had said, her kind eyes full of concern. "Is everything all right with Michael? You usually mention him by now." Josephine had deflected with vague comments about him being busy with work, unwilling to expose the raw wound of their estrangement to scrutiny, even from someone as understanding as Margaret. She was arranging flowers in the front hall, white lilies that reminded her painfully of Robert's funeral, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Hello, Mrs. David. This is Dr. Sarah Chen from Minneapolis Therapy Associates. I have Lily Morrison here, and she's asked me to call you." Josephine's heart stopped. Lily was Michael's half-sister, the daughter she'd had with Robert when she thought her child-rearing days were behind her. At 30, Lily had become a successful therapist herself, specializing in family dynamics, a career choice that had always seemed like gentle irony, given their own complicated family history. "Is she all right? Is there an emergency?" "She's fine physically, but she's quite upset. She'd like to speak with you, but she wanted a neutral party to facilitate the call. Would you be willing to talk with her now?" Josephine's mind raced. Why would Lily need a therapist to call her own mother? They'd always had an easy relationship complicated only by the 16-year age gap between Lily and Michael that had created more of an aunt-nephew dynamic than traditional siblings. Of course. Put her on. There was a rustling sound, voices in the background, and then Lily's familiar voice, though it sounded strained and careful. Mom, I'm sorry to call you like this, but I needed to talk to you, and I thought having Dr. Chin here might help keep things calm. Lily's sweetheart, what's wrong? You're scaring me. Michael came to see me yesterday. The words came out in a rush as if Lily had been rehearsing them. He told me about your conversation about the divorce money. Mom, I need to understand what happened. Josephine felt her chest tighten. Of course, Michael had gone to Lily. She was the family mediator, the one who smoothed over conflicts and maintained connections. But also Lily was someone whose approval Michael had always craved, perhaps because she'd achieved the professional success that had eluded him. What did he tell you? He said. Lily's voice caught slightly. He said you refused to help him when he's facing financial ruin. That you have millions of dollars, but you won't spare what amounts to pocket change to save his future. The words hit Josephine like physical blows. Not because they were untrue, but because they contained just enough truth to be devastating. She could picture Michael delivering this version of events with his characteristic wounded charm, painting himself as the abandoned son and her as the heartless miser. That's not exactly how it happened. Then tell me how it did happen, because I'm confused and hurt, and I don't know what to think. Lily's professional composure was cracking, revealing the emotional daughter underneath. Michael was crying, Mom. Actually crying. He said you told him he was a failure and that you'd been keeping track of every dollar you'd ever given him like some kind of ledger. Josephine closed her eyes, recognizing her own words twisted into weapons. I didn't say he was a failure. I said I'd been enabling him, and I showed him the financial records to help him understand the pattern. The pattern? Lily? In the 25 years since Michael graduated college, I've given or loaned him over $250,000. None of the loans have been repaid. Every few years, there's a crisis that only I can solve. She heard Lily take a sharp breath. $250,000. I kept exact records. It started small, help with his first apartment deposit, car payments when his business was getting started. But it escalated, business investments that failed, divorce settlements, emergency loans that became gifts. But Mom, if you could afford it, could I afford it? Or did I make sacrifices so I could afford it? Josephine moved to the window, looking out at the garden she and Robert had planted together. Do you remember when you wanted to go to that expensive summer art program in France when you were 16?
Yes.
You said we couldn't afford it that year. We couldn't afford it because I'd just given Michael $40,000 for his first failed startup. I chose to prioritize his immediate crisis over your long-term opportunity. The silence that followed was profound. Josephine could hear Dr. Chen's voice in the background, too quiet to make out words, but the tone was soothing, professional. I never knew that, Lily said finally. There were a lot of things you never knew. I tried to keep the family conflicts away from you to let you focus on your own life and career, but the pattern was always there. Michael's needs came first because Michael's needs were always presented as emergencies. But this is an emergency. A divorce can destroy someone financially, can it? Or does it force someone to finally live within their means? Josephine's voice gained strength as she found her footing in familiar territory, the logic of financial planning. Michael owns a house he can't afford, drives a car that costs more than most people's annual salary, and maintains a lifestyle that requires constant subsidies. Maybe losing some of that isn't destruction. Maybe it's reality. Mom, you sound so cold. The accusation stung because Josephine feared it might be true. Had decades in finance, decades of making hard decisions based on numbers rather than emotions, made her incapable of the unconditional support her son needed. I don't feel cold. I feel like a mother who finally realized that helping and enabling aren't the same thing. But he's our family. And what about my responsibility to myself, to my own future security? Josephine moved away from the window, needing to pace as her frustration built. Lily, I'm 72 years old. Do you know what long-term care costs in this city? What happens if I develop dementia or need assisted living? If I keep depleting my resources for Michael's crisis, who's going to take care of me? We would. Michael and I would take care of you, would you? Because Michael's 46 and has never taken care of anyone, including himself, and you're 30 with your own life, your own future family to think about. I can't build my security on assumptions about what you might be willing to do 20 years from now. She heard Lily crying softly, and the sound broke something inside her chest. This was exactly what she'd feared, that standing up to Michael would fracture the entire family, turning her children against each other and against her. I don't understand how we got here, Lily whispered. We used to be close, all of us. We were close because I made it easy. I smoothed over every conflict, solved every problem, made sure no one had to face consequences or make hard choices. But that's not sustainable, sweetheart.
And it's not healthy.
So, you're going to let Michael lose everything to teach him a lesson? I'm going to let Michael handle his own crisis, so he can learn that he's capable of surviving without me. And if he's not capable, if this destroys him? The question pierced straight to Josephine's deepest fear. What if she was wrong? What if Michael truly couldn't handle this crisis? And her refusal to help led to some kind of breakdown or worse. Then I'll have learned something terrible about the man I raised, she said quietly. But I don't think that's what will happen. I think Michael is stronger than he knows and more capable than he's ever had to prove. He doesn't feel strong right now. He feels abandoned. Sometimes feeling abandoned is the first step toward feeling independent. Dr. Chen's voice became audible in the background. And after a moment, Lily came back on the line. Mom, Dr. Chen thinks we should take a break from this conversation. She says emotions are running too high for productive dialogue. Of course, Lily, I want you to know that I love you and I love Michael. That's why I'm doing this. I know you think that, but it doesn't feel like love from where I'm sitting. The call ended, leaving Josephine staring at her phone and feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She'd expected Michael's anger, had prepared herself for his threats and manipulation, but she hadn't anticipated how his version of events would sound to Lily, how reasonable his pain would seem to someone who didn't know the full history. Over the next few days, she began to understand the scope of Michael's campaign. Margaret Chen called on Thursday, her voice carefully neutral. Josephine, dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I ran into Michael at the grocery store yesterday. He seemed quite distressed. I'm sure he was. Josephine kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. He mentioned that he's going through a difficult divorce and that family support has been limited. I don't mean to pry, but is there anything I can do to help? The careful phrasing told Josephine everything she needed to know. Michael had shared just enough information to paint himself as the victim without providing context that might complicate the narrative. It's a family matter, Margaret. We're working through it. Of course, of course. I just want you to know that if there's financial stress, I know how expensive divorce can be. Harold and I would be happy to help bridge any gap temporarily. The offer was kind and well-intentioned, but it confirmed Josephine's worst fears. Michael wasn't just seeking alternative sources of funding. He was systematically undermining her reputation in their community, presenting himself as the abandoned son of a wealthy but heartless mother. That evening, she found a message on her voicemail from her hairdresser, canceling her standing appointment due to a family emergency. The next day, her yoga instructor mentioned that several class members had asked about her family situation with expressions of concern that felt more like judgment. By Saturday, when she arrived at her bridge club, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Conversations stopped when she entered the room, and the usual warm greetings were replaced by polite but distant acknowledgments. Josephine, said Patricia Hartwell, the club president, as they settled at their table. We've all been thinking about you this week. That's kind of you. Family troubles can be so difficult, especially when they involve financial disagreements. Patricia's tone was carefully neutral, but her meaning was clear. Sometimes it helps to talk things through with friends who have faced similar challenges. Josephine looked around the table at women she'd known for over a decade. Women who'd supported her through Robert's illness and death, who'd celebrated her business successes and shared their own family struggles. Now they were looking at her with a mixture of concern and confusion, trying to reconcile the generous friend they knew with the selfish mother Michael had described. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully, "but some family matters are best handled privately." Of course, Patricia agreed, though sometimes privacy can be isolating when what we really need is community support. The game proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that made concentration impossible. Josephine found herself making basic errors, miscounting points, forgetting which cards had been played. By the end of the afternoon, she'd lost more hands than she'd won in months, and the looks of pity from her partners felt almost worse than outright criticism would have. As she gathered her purse to leave, Patricia touched her arm gently. "Josephine, I hope you'll consider that sometimes being right isn't as important as being kind. Family relationships are precious things, and once they're broken, they can be very difficult to repair." The words followed Josephine home, echoing in her mind as she sat in her empty house and wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Michael's campaign was working. He was successfully reframing her choice as cruelty rather than courage, selfishness rather than tough love. But what frightened her most wasn't the community's shifting opinion. It was the growing doubt in her own heart. As she sat in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the comfortable furnishings of the life she'd worked so hard to build, she wondered if independence was worth the price she was beginning to pay. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows like an accusation, and Josephine David realized that saying no to her son might have been the easy part. Living with the consequences was going to be much harder than she'd ever imagined. The cracks in Josephine's carefully constructed world widened like fractures in ice, each small, slight, and cold shoulder adding pressure until she wondered when the entire structure might collapse beneath her. It had been 3 weeks since her conversation with Lily, and the silence from both her children felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest every morning when she woke. Thursday arrived with the false promise of routine. Bridge Club had been her anchor for 12 years, a weekly gathering that had sustained her through Robert's illness, the challenges of building her business, and the ordinary struggles of aging. But as she drove toward the Adena Country Club, her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and she found herself rehearsing casual responses to questions she hoped wouldn't come. The dining room buzzed with its usual pregame chatter when she arrived, but something felt different in the quality of the silence that followed her entrance. Conversations didn't stop abruptly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they shifted, becoming more subdued, more careful. "Josephine, dear." Patricia Hartwell rose from their usual table, her smile bright, but somehow distant. "You look lovely today. That blue brings out your eyes." The compliment felt rehearsed, the kind of thing people said when they were working harder than usual to appear normal. Josephine took her seat, noting how the others arranged themselves. Not quite turned away from her, but not quite facing her either. "How has everyone been?" she asked, settling her purse and pulling out her score pad, desperate to maintain the illusion of normalcy. "Oh, you know how it is," said Dorothy Brennan, shuffling the cards with practiced efficiency. "The usual complaints about grandchildren who never call and husbands who leave dishes in the sink." Easy laughter that should have followed felt forced. Josephine caught the meaningful look that passed between Dorothy and Patricia. She'd seen that look before. It was the same expression she'd witnessed when Eleanor Martinez had gone through her messy public divorce or when Janet Powell's son had been arrested for embezzlement. It was the look of people who knew something uncomfortable and were trying to decide how much compassion to extend. "Speaking of family," Patricia said as she dealt the first hand, her tone carefully casual. "How are your children, Josephine? It's been a while since you've mentioned them." The question landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of tension around the table. Josephine felt 4 pairs of eyes watching her response, waiting to see how she would handle what everyone clearly knew was a loaded inquiry. "They're well," she said, arranging her cards with steady hands despite the racing of her heart. "Busy with their own lives, as adult children should be." "That's wonderful," Dorothy said, though her tone suggested she thought it was anything but. "It's so important for families to stay close, especially during difficult times." There it was, the opening salvo in what Josephine now realized would be a careful interrogation disguised as friendly concern. She bid 2 clubs, hoping to keep the focus on the game. But Patricia wasn't finished. "I saw Michael at the grocery store last week," Patricia continued, studying her cards with exaggerated concentration. "He looked tired."
Poor thing.
Divorce is so draining, isn't it? Especially when it involves significant assets. "I imagine it is," Josephine replied evenly, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. "Such a shame when families can't come together during times like that," added Ruth Morrison. No relation to Lily's husband, but a woman who'd made a career of knowing everyone's business. "I always think that's when we need each other most." The criticism was gentle but unmistakable, wrapped in the kind of concerned language that made direct confrontation impossible. Josephine played her card and watched as the others followed suit. But she could sense the weight of their collective judgment settling over the table like fog. "Family dynamics can be complex," she said carefully. "Sometimes what looks like helping from the outside might actually be enabling dependence." "Oh my," Patricia said, raising her eyebrows slightly. "That sounds very clinical." "Josephine was in business for so many years," Dorothy explained to the table as if Josephine weren't sitting right there. "I imagine that gives you a different perspective on financial matters. More analytical." The word analytical was delivered with a faint distaste usually reserved for discussing something slightly unseemly, like bodily functions at dinner. Josephine felt a flare of anger. These women had celebrated her business success when it benefited them, when she donated generously to their charities or provided free financial advice. Now, that same expertise was being reframed as cold calculation. "I think experience teaches us all valuable lessons," she said, struggling to keep her voice level. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow people to solve their own problems." "But surely not when they're family," Ruth said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who'd found her favorite topic. "I mean, what's the point of having resources if you won't share them with your own children?" The question echoed Michael's words so precisely that Josephine wondered if he'd coached these women, or if the sentiment was simply so obvious that everyone would naturally arrive at the same conclusion. Either way, she felt increasingly isolated, surrounded by people who saw her position as incomprehensible. "Resources are finite," she said quietly, "even when they appear abundant." "Are they, though?" Patricia's smile was sharp now, no longer bothering with the pretense of gentle concern. "I mean, at our age, what are we really saving for? We can't take it with us." The familiar refrain, the one that dismissed her right to financial security in her own remaining years, made something snap inside Josephine's chest. "I'm saving for the possibility that I might live to 90 and need care that costs thousands of dollars a month. I'm saving for the dignity of not becoming a burden to my children. I'm saving for the independence I've worked 40 years to achieve." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. The other women exchanged glances that spoke volumes about what they thought of her priorities. "Of course," Patricia said finally, her voice dripping with false understanding. "Though I suppose some people might say that being a burden is just part of the natural cycle of family life. Parents sacrifice for children, and then children sacrifice for parents. And some people might say that teaching children to be self-sufficient is the greatest gift a parent can give them," Josephine replied. But even to her own ears, her voice sounded defensive rather than confident. The game continued with stilted conversation and meaningful silences. By the time they tallied the final scores, Josephine had lost decisively, her concentration shattered by the undercurrents of criticism. She felt drained and shaken in a way that had nothing to do with cards. As she gathered her purse to leave, Patricia touched her arm with what might have been genuine sympathy or calculated manipulation. "Josephine, I hope you know we're all concerned about you. This situation with Michael, well, it's affecting more than just your family. People are talking." "What are they saying?" The question slipped out before Josephine could stop it, revealing just how much the social pressure was getting to her. "Nothing malicious," Patricia assured her quickly. "Just concern. Worry that perhaps you're being advised poorly or that you don't understand how serious Michael's situation really is." I understand perfectly.
Do you?
Because from the outside, it looks like a wealthy mother watching her son face financial ruin while she sits on millions of dollars. It's hard for people to comprehend. Josephine felt the familiar weight of doubt pressing against her resolve. These women had been her friends, her community, her support system. If they couldn't understand her position, if they saw her as selfish and cold, what did that say about her choices? Sometimes doing the right thing isn't popular, she said. But the words felt hollow. And sometimes being popular isn't about doing the right thing, Patricia replied gently. Sometimes it's about doing the loving thing. The drive home felt endless. Every traffic light a chance for doubt to creep deeper into her thoughts. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the house she'd worked so hard to secure and wondering if she was going to lose everything that mattered while fighting to protect things that suddenly seemed insignificant. Her phone rang as she walked through the front door. Margaret Chen's name appeared on the caller ID, and Josephine felt her stomach clench with anticipation of another difficult conversation. Hello, Margaret. Josephine, dear, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Do you have a few minutes to talk? The formal politeness in Margaret's voice, so different from their usual easy familiarity, told Josephine everything she needed to know about the nature of this call. Of course. I was wondering if I might stop by this afternoon. There's something I'd like to discuss with you, and I think it would be better to do it in person. An hour later, Margaret sat in Josephine's living room, perched on the edge of the sofa as if she might need to make a quick escape. She'd brought flowers, white chrysanthemums that looked suspiciously like the ones people brought to funerals, and had accepted tea she didn't seem to want. I'm not sure where to begin, Margaret said, setting down her cup with trembling hands. This is very difficult for me. Just say what you came to say. I've been talking to Michael. The words came out in a rush, as if Margaret had been holding them back with great effort. Not intentionally. We keep running into each other at the grocery store, the post office, various places around town. And Josephine, I have to tell you, he's not doing well. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Margaret's tone sharpened slightly. Because he told me about your conversation about how you refused to help him with his divorce expenses, and I have to say, I'm having trouble understanding your position. Josephine felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with having to defend herself to someone whose opinion mattered to her. Did he tell you why I refused? He said you thought he was too dependent on you, that you wanted to teach him a lesson about self-sufficiency. Margaret's expression was pained, as if the words tasted bitter. Josephine, the man is facing financial ruin. His wife is trying to take everything he has. This isn't the time for tough love. When is the time? When he's 50, 60, when I'm dead and can't enable him anymore. Enable him. Margaret's voice rose slightly. Josephine, you're talking about your son. Your only son. The child you raised and claimed to love. I do love him. That's exactly why I can't keep rescuing him from the consequences of his choices. His choices? Margaret set down her teacup with enough force to make it rattle against the saucer. What choice did he make in having a vindictive wife who's trying to destroy him financially? He chose to marry her. He chose to live beyond his means. He chose to build a lifestyle that requires constant subsidies from me. Josephine could hear her voice getting stronger, but she wasn't sure if it was conviction or desperation driving her words. So, you're going to punish him for those choices by letting him lose everything? I'm going to let him face the natural consequences of those choices, so he can learn to make better ones. Margaret stared at her for a long moment, and Josephine could see years of friendship being reassessed, recalculated against this new information about who she really was. I don't recognize you, Margaret said quietly. The Josephine I know would move heaven and earth to help someone she loved, especially her own child. The Josephine you know did move heaven and earth for him repeatedly for 25 years, and all it did was teach him that he never had to move anything for himself. So, you decided to stop being his mother? The accusation hit like a physical blow. I've decided to start being the kind of mother who prepares him for a life. I won't always be here to subsidize. Margaret gathered her purse and stood, her movements stiff with disapproval. I think you're making a terrible mistake, Josephine. I think you're letting pride and stubbornness destroy the most important relationship in your life. And I think that someday, when it's too late to fix this, you're going to realize that being right isn't worth being alone." After Margaret left, Josephine sat in her living room, surrounded by the comfortable furnishings of her successful life, and felt more isolated than she had since Robert's death. The silence in the house seemed to press against her from all sides, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of traffic on France Avenue. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and for a wild moment, she hoped it might be from Michael or Lily. Instead, it was from her book club president, regretfully informing her that this month's meeting had been moved to a date when she wouldn't be able to attend due to a prior commitment. Josephine stared at the message and realized that her social world, the network of relationships and activities that had sustained her through decades of challenges, was crumbling around her. Michael's campaign wasn't just turning her family against her, it was systematically dismantling the community connections that had given her life meaning and support. As evening fell and the house grew dark around her, Josephine David sat alone and wondered if the price of independence might be higher than she was prepared to pay. The foundation of her life, built on decades of careful planning, hard work, and principled decision-making, was showing cracks that ran deeper than she'd ever imagined possible. But underneath the doubt and isolation, a small flame of determination still flickered. She had built a life and a business from nothing once before. She had survived divorce, illness, loss, and the countless small cruelties that came with being a woman in a man's profession. The question now was whether she had the strength to survive being right when everyone she cared about was convinced she was wrong. The elevator in the Wells Fargo Center moved with the same smooth precision it had 30 years ago when Josephine had first ridden it to business meetings that would shape her career. Now, as she ascended to the 40th floor, where Dr. Marcus Williams maintained his modest consulting office, she felt like a different person entirely. Not the confident businesswoman who had once commanded boardrooms, but a 72-year-old woman seeking wisdom from the only person who might understand the weight of her choice. Marcus had been her business partner for 15 years, her friend for longer than that, and the closest thing to a mentor she'd ever had in a profession that hadn't welcomed women with open arms. When she'd called him that morning, her voice breaking slightly as she asked if they could meet, he'd cleared his afternoon schedule without question. "Josephine." Marcus rose from behind his desk as she entered, his 75-year-old frame still carrying the authority that had made him one of Minneapolis's most respected financial advisors. His embrace was warm, paternal, and for a moment, she allowed herself to lean into the comfort of unconditional acceptance. "You sounded troubled on the phone."
What's going on?
She settled into the familiar leather chair across from his desk, the same seat where they'd planned strategy for difficult clients, celebrated successful quarters, and navigated the challenges of building a business in an industry that preferred its women silent and its advice predictable. "I think I may have made the biggest mistake of my life," she said, surprised by how small her voice sounded in the spacious office. Marcus poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he'd always kept brewing, a ritual that had anchored thousands of their conversations over the decades. "Tell me." The story spilled out of her in fragments. Michael's demand, her refusal, the social ostracism that had followed. Marcus listened without interruption, his weathered hands steepled before him, his gray eyes reflecting the kind of patience that came from years of helping people navigate their most difficult decisions. "So now I'm sitting in my house every evening wondering if I've chosen my financial principles over my son's well-being," she concluded. "And everyone, my neighbors, my friends, even Lily, thinks I'm a heartless woman who values money more than family." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Minneapolis skyline they'd both watched evolve over the decades. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned experience. "Do you remember David?" Josephine nodded. Marcus's son had been a brilliant child, full of promise and charm, not unlike Michael in many ways. But David's story had taken a darker turn than her son's financial irresponsibility. "The addiction started in college," Marcus continued, his voice steady but distant. "Prescription pills at first, then harder drugs. And for years, Josephine, for years, Helen and I threw money at the problem. Rehab programs, therapy, apartment deposits when he got evicted, bail money when he got arrested. We told ourselves we were helping, that we were being good parents. You were trying to save him. We were enabling him. The words came out with the finality of a judgment long since rendered. Every dollar we gave him, every crisis we solved, every consequence we cushioned, it all taught him the same lesson: that his choices didn't really matter, because we would always be there to fix things. Josephine felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of familiar patterns in an unfamiliar context. What happened? He overdosed in the apartment we were paying for using drugs he'd bought with money Helen had given him for groceries. Marcus's voice remained steady, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. The paramedics saved him that time, but it was close. Too close. What did you do? We cut him off completely. No money, no housing, no safety net of any kind. Marcus met her eyes directly. It was the hardest thing Helen and I ever did. Our son was homeless for 8 months. He lived in shelters, on the streets, wherever he could find a place to sleep. Our friends thought we were monsters. Helen's sister stopped speaking to us. But he survived. More than that, he got clean. Really clean. Not the temporary sobriety we'd seen a dozen times before, when he knew we were watching. He got a job. Minimum wage, but steady. He learned to budget, to solve problems, to take responsibility for his choices. Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she'd seen from him since she'd arrived. That was 12 years ago. He's been sober ever since. He's married now, has 2 kids, owns a small construction business. In your relationship with him, it's better than it's ever been because it's based on reality instead of codependency. He doesn't come to us with problems anymore. He comes to share his successes, to ask for advice rather than money, to include us in a life he's built with his own hands. Josephine felt tears starting, a mixture of relief and fear that made her chest tight. But what if Michael isn't as strong as David? What if this destroys him instead of saving him? Marcus leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. Then you'll learn something important about the man you raised. But Josephine, I've known Michael since he was a child.
He's not weak.
He's untested. There's a difference. The community pressure is intense. People think I'm being cruel. People thought Helen and I were being cruel, too. They couldn't understand how we could watch our son suffer when we had the resources to help. But they didn't understand that our help was actually prolonging his suffering, making it worse. How did you handle the judgment? Marcus was quiet for a moment, and she could see him remembering those difficult years. We held on to each other and on to the belief that love sometimes requires us to do things that feel like the opposite of love. We reminded ourselves daily that enabling someone isn't kindness. It's fear disguised as compassion.
Fear.
Fear that they can't handle life without us. Fear that we failed as parents if our children struggle. Fear that letting them fall means we don't love them enough. Marcus's voice grew stronger, more certain. But the truth is, believing in someone's ability to survive and grow, even when they don't believe it themselves, that's the deepest kind of love there is. Josephine felt something loosening in her chest. A tension she'd been carrying for weeks was finally beginning to ease. Michael threatened never to speak to her again. David said the same thing.
He meant it too for a while.
But eventually, when he got healthy, he realized that their refusal to enable him was the greatest gift they'd ever given him. And if he hadn't gotten healthy, then they would have grieved the loss of their son while knowing they'd done everything they could to help him become the man he was capable of being. Marcus reached across the desk and touched her hand gently. Josephine, you can't save Michael by destroying your own security. You can't love him into health by making his problems disappear. All you can do is believe in his capacity to grow and refuse to stand in the way of that growth. The sun was setting over Minneapolis as Josephine prepared to leave, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded her of the evening light in her garden. She felt different than she had when she'd arrived, not completely at peace, but stronger, more certain of her path. The isolation is difficult, she admitted as Marcus walked her to the elevator. It is, he agreed, but it's temporary. The people who truly matter will eventually see the wisdom in what you're doing. And Michael, if he's the man I think he is, will thank you someday for loving him enough to let him become independent. As the elevator descended, carrying her back toward the street level and the difficult days ahead, Josephine felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would work out easily, but the deeper hope that came from knowing she was doing the right thing, even when it felt like the hardest thing. The foundation of her conviction, cracked and shaken by weeks of doubt and social pressure, was beginning to solidify again. Whatever came next, Michael's continued anger, the community's judgment, the painful process of watching her son face consequences, she would meet it with the strength that had carried her through 4 decades of challenges. Marcus Williams had reminded her of something she'd temporarily forgotten, that sometimes the most loving thing a parent could do was step aside and let their child discover their own strength. The first sign that Michael's situation had deteriorated came at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning when Josephine was startled awake by the sound of someone pounding on her front door. She pulled on her robe and hurried downstairs, her heart racing with the kind of fear that comes from unexpected disturbances in the pre-dawn darkness. Through the peephole, she could see Michael standing on her doorstep. But he looked nothing like the composed man who had charmed his way through dinner just weeks ago. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them, and there was a wild quality to his posture that spoke of desperation, barely held in check. "Michael." She opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain latch engaged. "What's wrong? It's not even dawn." "Let me in, Mom, please. I need to talk to you." His voice cracked slightly, and she could see that his hands were trembling. Whether from cold, caffeine, or something worse, she couldn't tell. Against her better judgment, she unlatched the door and stepped aside. He pushed past her into the hallway, bringing with him the smell of stale coffee and the particular odor of someone who hadn't showered in days. "You look terrible," she said, following him into the living room. "When did you last eat? When did you last sleep?" "I can't eat. I can't sleep. Everything is falling apart, and you're the only person who can stop it." He turned to face her, and she was shocked by the dark circles under his eyes, the gaunt quality that suggested he'd lost weight rapidly. "Amanda's lawyer filed an emergency motion to freeze all my assets. Everything, Mom, the house, the business accounts, even my personal checking account." Josephine felt a stab of genuine concern despite her resolve. "On what grounds?" "They're claiming I'm hiding assets, that I might try to transfer money offshore before the settlement." His laugh was bitter, brittle, ironic. "Isn't it? They think I have money to hide. What does your attorney say?" "I don't have an attorney." The words exploded from him with such force that she took a step backward. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. I can't afford one without your help, and now I can't even access my own money to try to hire a cheaper one." The desperation in his voice tugged at something deep in her chest, the same maternal instinct that had driven her to soothe his childhood nightmares and tend to his scraped knees. But underneath her sympathy, she could hear Marcus Williams' voice. "Every dollar we gave him taught him that his choices didn't really matter because we would always be there to fix things." "Michael, sit down. Let's think through your options rationally." "My options?" He began pacing again, his movements sharp and agitated. "My options are to get help for my mother or watch everything I've worked for disappear. Those are my options. You could represent yourself initially just to get the asset freeze lifted. You could apply for public defender. You could." He wheeled around to face her, his eyes blazing with a fury she'd never seen before. "Stop talking to me like I'm some indigent stranger asking for charity. I'm your son, your only son, and I'm telling you that I need help or I lose everything. I'm telling you that I can't keep being your safety net. It's not helping you. It's hurting you." "Hurting me?"
His voice rose to near shouting.
"How is letting me become homeless helping me? How is watching Amanda take everything I own because I can't afford to fight back helping me? Because maybe losing everything will teach you to build something sustainable instead of something that requires constant subsidies from me." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Michael stared at her as if she'd slapped him, his face cycling through disbelief, hurt, and something harder. You really believe that, don't you? You really think this is some kind of character building exercise? I think you're 46 years old, and you've never faced a major crisis without expecting me to solve it for you. Because you're my mother. Because that's what mothers do for their children.
Is it?
Or is that what I've trained you to expect? Because I was too guilty about my divorce, too afraid of losing you, to let you develop your own resilience. Michael stopped pacing abruptly, something shifting in his expression. Guilty about the divorce? What does that have to do with anything? Josephine felt exposed, as if she'd revealed more than she'd intended. I always wondered if your struggles were my fault. If I damaged you by breaking up our family, so I compensated by trying to shield you from every difficulty. And now you've decided to stop. I've decided that shielding you hasn't helped either of us grow. Grow? His laugh was harsh, desperate. I'm not a child, Mom. I don't need to grow. I need a lawyer. The bluntness of his statement crystallized everything Marcus had tried to explain to her. Michael couldn't see past the immediate crisis to the pattern it represented. To him, each emergency was isolated, unconnected to the choices that had led to it or the lessons that might prevent the next one. What happens after this crisis? She asked quietly. What happens when you've spent another $100,000 of my money and the next emergency comes? Because there will be a next one, Michael. There always is. There won't be a next one. This is it. This is the crisis that determines whether I have a future or not. You said the same thing about your first business failing and your first divorce and the real estate investment that went bad. This is different.
How?
He stared at her, and she could see him searching for words that would make her understand the difference between this crisis and all the others. But they both knew there was no difference. Only the escalating stakes of a pattern that had been repeating for decades. You know what? His voice had gone quiet now. Dangerous. I've been talking to some people, lawyers who specialize in elder law. They tell me that when elderly people make irrational financial decisions, like refusing to help family members despite having abundant resources, it can be a sign of cognitive decline. The threat hit her like ice water. Michael, you can't be serious. Dead serious. A competency hearing could determine whether you're still capable of managing your own finances. And if you're not, he shrugged, but his eyes were cold, calculating. Well, someone would need to step in to protect your interests. You would really do that to me? You would try to have me declared incompetent because I won't give you money? I would do whatever it takes to save my life, just like you're apparently willing to do whatever it takes to destroy it. The man standing in her living room was no longer the charming son who had kissed her cheek and complimented her cooking. This was someone she didn't recognize. Someone capable of using the legal system as a weapon against his own mother. Get out, she said quietly. Mom, get out of my house now. He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him calculating whether to push further or retreat. Finally, he headed toward the door but stopped in the hallway to look back at her. You think you're teaching me a lesson about independence?
He said.
But all you're teaching me is that I can't count on anyone, not even my own mother. After he left, Josephine stood in her living room and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The son she had raised, worried over and loved unconditionally, had just threatened to destroy her life to save his own. The boy who had once brought her dandelions and called them flowers had become a man willing to use her age and vulnerability against her. For the first time since this crisis began, she wondered if Marcus had been wrong. Maybe some people couldn't be saved by tough love. Maybe some people were simply too damaged, too entitled, too willing to hurt others to preserve their own comfort. But even as the thought formed, she pushed it away. Michael was desperate, and desperate people did desperate things. The question now was whether his desperation would lead to growth or to destruction, and whether she would survive finding out the answer. Margaret Chen was trimming her prize-winning roses when she witnessed the scene that would change everything. It was Thursday afternoon, 3 days after Michael's threatening visit, and Josephine was returning from her grocery shopping when Michael's BMW screeched into the driveway with a violence that sent gravel flying across the lawn from her position behind the hedge that separated their properties. Margaret watched as Michael erupted from his car like a man possessed. His shirt was untucked, his hair wild, and when he began shouting at his mother in the driveway, His voice carried across the quiet suburban street with a raw desperation that made Margaret's hands freeze on her pruning shears. "You think you can ignore me? You think you can just pretend I don't exist?" Michael's words were slurred slightly. Whether from exhaustion or something else, Margaret couldn't tell. "I'm your son, your only son, and you're going to stand there and watch me lose everything." Josephine stood perfectly still beside her car, grocery bags in her hands, her posture radiating the kind of dignity Margaret had always admired. But now, watching Michael advance on his elderly mother with clenched fists and wild eyes, Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of the family drama she'd been judging from a distance. "Michael, please lower your voice." The neighbors. His voice cracked with rage. "Let them hear what kind of mother abandons her child when he needs her most." Margaret had heard enough family arguments over the years to recognize the difference between normal conflict and something darker. This wasn't a son asking for help. This was a man on the edge of something dangerous, and his target was a 72-year-old woman who suddenly looked very small and vulnerable standing in her own driveway. "I need to call someone," Margaret murmured to herself, reaching for her phone. But the confrontation was escalating too quickly. "You want to see what desperation looks like?" Michael was shouting now, pulling papers from his jacket. "These are competency petition forms. All I have to do is file them, and we'll see how independent you feel when a judge decides whether you're mentally fit to control your own money." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Margaret felt her stomach lurch with recognition of what she was witnessing. This wasn't a family disagreement. This was elder abuse played out in broad daylight on a quiet Adena street. Josephine's response was so quiet Margaret had to strain to hear it. "If you file those papers, you will no longer be my son." "I stopped being your son the day you chose money over family," Michael snarled. But even from her hiding place, Margaret could see something break in his posture. The papers fluttered from his hands, scattering across the driveway like fallen leaves. He was gone as suddenly as he'd arrived, leaving his mother standing alone among her scattered groceries and the legal documents that had threatened to destroy her autonomy. Margaret watched as Josephine slowly bent to collect the papers, her movements careful and deliberate, as if sudden motions might shatter whatever composure she was maintaining. That evening, Margaret called Patricia Hartwell. "Patricia, we need to talk about Josephine David. I think we've all made a terrible mistake." Within 24 hours, the story of Michael's public breakdown had spread through their social circle like wildfire, but with a very different interpretation than his previous narrative. Suddenly, Bridge Club conversations centered not around Josephine's selfishness, but around Michael's shocking behavior. The man who had seemed like a victim of his mother's cruelty was revealed as someone capable of threatening an elderly woman in her own driveway. "I feel sick about how he treated her," Patricia confessed during their emergency Bridge Club meeting. "He played us like fiddles, didn't he? He knew exactly what to say to make us think she was the problem." Dorothy agreed, her face flushed with embarrassment, and we believed him because it fit our assumptions about what mothers should do. The community's opinion was shifting. But for Josephine, standing at her kitchen window and watching the street where her son had publicly threatened her, the validation felt hollow. She had been right about Michael's dependency, but she had never imagined it would lead to this, to a man so desperate he would weaponize her age and vulnerability against her. The phone rang, interrupting her dark thoughts. Amanda's name appeared on the caller ID. "Mrs. David, I think we need to talk." Amanda Westbrook's voice carried the kind of controlled composure that Josephine recognized from her own years of navigating difficult business negotiations. But underneath the professional veneer, she could hear something else. A weariness that spoke of battles fought and won at great personal cost. "Mrs. David, I hope you don't mind me calling. I know this situation is complicated, but I think there are things you need to know about Michael. Things that might help you understand why your decision to refuse him money was absolutely the right one." Josephine settled into her kitchen chair, the same seat where she'd taken so many difficult calls over the years.
"I'm listening."
"First, I want you to know that I never asked for this divorce to be a financial war. I suggested mediation, collaborative divorce, even offered to let Michael keep the house if he could take over the mortgage payments. Amanda's voice carried a note of frustration, but Michael insisted on hiring an aggressive attorney, convinced that if he fought hard enough, he could somehow avoid any financial responsibility for our marriage. What happened to change that? When he couldn't afford the retainer for the lawyer he wanted, he came to me asking if I would lend him the money to fight me in court. Amanda's laugh was bitter.
Can you imagine?
He wanted me to fund his own legal battle against me. The absurdity of it would have been almost funny if it weren't so perfectly characteristic of Michael's approach to problem solving. Always looking for someone else to bear the cost of his choices, even when that someone was his adversary. When I refused, he became different, desperate in a way that scared me. He started calling me at all hours, showing up at my workplace, following me to my parents' house. That's when I realized I needed protection, not just from his demands, but from him. Is that why the asset freeze was so aggressive? Partly, but also because my attorney discovered that Michael had been moving money around, trying to hide assets in accounts under your name. Did you know about the offshore account he opened using your social security number? Josephine felt the room tilt around her. What? He forged your signature on banking documents, Mrs. David. We have copies. My attorney was planning to file fraud charges, but when we realized you weren't involved, that you likely didn't even know about it, we decided to handle it through the divorce proceedings instead. The revelation hit Josephine like a physical blow. Her son hadn't just threatened to have her declared incompetent. He had actually committed fraud using her identity, putting her at legal risk without her knowledge or consent. How much money? About $40,000. Money he claimed came from consulting fees, but that we believe actually came from loans he obtained using false information about his assets. Josephine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Marcus Williams' warnings taking on new dimensions. Michael's dependency hadn't just stunted his emotional growth, it had led him into actual criminal behavior. Mrs. David, are you all right? I'm processing. This is more than I knew. There's something else. Michael told me about his childhood, about how you always rescued him from financial problems. He said it with pride, as if it proved how much you loved him. But I could see that it had actually damaged him in ways he couldn't understand. How so? He never learned that actions have consequences. In his mind, every problem was temporary because you would always fix it. So when our marriage had problems, he couldn't understand why love and charm weren't enough to solve them. When his business struggled, he couldn't grasp why hard work and better planning were necessary. Everything was always someone else's responsibility to fix. Amanda's words painted a picture that Josephine recognized but had never been able to see clearly. The portrait of a man who had never developed the internal resources necessary for adult life because he'd never been required to do so. The morning I left him, he was on the phone with you, expecting you to solve our marriage problems by paying for couples therapy. Not because he thought therapy would help, but because having someone else pay for it meant he didn't have to take it seriously. It was just another service being provided for him. And when I stopped providing services, he couldn't understand it. In his mind, you were breaking an unspoken contract. He'd been the good son, the charming son, the son who made you feel needed. In exchange, you were supposed to solve his problems forever. The phone went quiet for a moment, and Josephine could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in the silence. Everything Amanda was describing aligned with her own growing understanding of the relationship she'd created with Michael. A relationship based on transaction rather than genuine love, control rather than trust. Amanda, why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that what you're doing, refusing to enable him anymore, it's not cruel. It's the only thing that might save him from himself. And because I want you to be prepared for what's coming next. What do you mean? He has filed the competency petition. And Mrs. David, the court papers were served to my attorney this morning as part of his motion to access your accounts to pay his legal fees. He's actually trying to have you declared mentally incompetent so he can control your finances. The words hit Josephine like a second blow, harder than the first, because she'd hoped, despite everything, that Michael's threat had been made in anger, not as a serious intention. How long do I have? The hearing is scheduled for next week, but Mrs. David, you should know that my attorney has already filed a motion to intervene. We're prepared to present evidence of Michael's fraud, his harassment, his pattern of financial manipulation. The judge will see who's really behaving irrationally in this situation. After Amanda hung up, Josephine sat in her kitchen staring at the phone and feeling as if the world had shifted on its axis. The son she had raised, the boy she had loved unconditionally, was not only willing to destroy her autonomy, he was actively working to do so through the legal system. The doorbell rang at 7:30 that evening, and through the peephole, Josephine could see a man in a suit holding an official-looking envelope. The process server was polite but efficient, handing her the legal documents that would force her to defend her own mental competency in court. She was reading through the petition, a document filled with lies about her supposed confusion, her alleged inability to make rational financial decisions, her purported need for a guardian to protect her from her own poor judgment, when she heard the sound of a car door slamming in her driveway. Michael stood on her doorstep, holding a bouquet of flowers, white roses, her favorites, and wearing the kind of contrite expression that had gotten him out of trouble since childhood. But now, knowing what she knew about the fraud, the legal maneuvering, the calculated cruelty of his actions, his apparent remorse looked like nothing more than another manipulation. "Mom, can we talk, please?" Against every instinct screaming at her to call the police, to slam the door, to protect herself from whatever new harm he might inflict, Josephine stepped aside and let him enter. Perhaps it was the mother in her that still hoped for some explanation, some path back to the relationship they'd once had. Or perhaps she simply needed to look him in the eye and understand how they'd arrived at this place. "I brought you flowers," he said, holding out the roses as if they were a peace offering rather than a prop in whatever performance he was about to give. "Thank you." She took them, but didn't move to put them in water. "I got the court papers, Michael." His face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, guilt, defiance, and finally a kind of resigned calculation. "I didn't want it to come to that. You forced my hand. I forced your hand by refusing to give you money. You forced my hand by abandoning me when I needed you most." His voice was rising again, the careful contrition beginning to crack. "Do you understand what you've done to me? Do you understand what I'm facing? I understand that you committed fraud using my identity. I understand that you've been lying to me, to Amanda, to everyone about your financial situation. I understand that instead of facing the consequences of your choices, you're trying to destroy my life to avoid them." Michael's face went pale, the roses forgotten in his hands. "Amanda told you about the account. She told me about a lot of things. About how you asked her to lend you money to fight her in court. About how you've been harassing her, following her, trying to manipulate her just like you've been trying to manipulate me." "I never harassed her. I was trying to save our marriage by stalking her, by refusing to accept that she didn't want to be married to you anymore, by fighting for what mattered to me." The words exploded from him with sudden fury, and Josephine saw the careful mask slip entirely. "Just like I'm fighting for what matters to me now. I'm not going to let you destroy my life because you've decided to play tough love games in your old age." Tough love games. Josephine felt her own anger rising, a clean, pure rage that burned away years of guilt and self-doubt. "Is that what you think this is? A game? I think it's a power trip. I think you've spent so many years controlling my life with your money that you can't stand the idea of letting me be truly independent." Independent. The word came out as a laugh, harsh and bitter. "Michael, you're 46 years old, and you just tried to have your own mother declared mentally incompetent so you could steal her money. In what universe is that independence? It's not stealing if it's going to be mine anyway when you die." The casual cruelty of the statement, the assumption that her money was rightfully his, that her death was simply a delayed inheritance payout, stripped away the last vestiges of Josephine's maternal instincts. She was no longer looking at her son. She was looking at a stranger who happened to share her DNA, a man who saw her not as a person with her own rights and needs, but as a resource to be exploited. "Get out," she said quietly. "Mom, I didn't mean get out of my house now. Look, I know I'm not handling this well, but I'm desperate. Can't you see that? I'm facing complete financial ruin, and you're the only person who can help me." "I'm not the only person who can help you. I'm just the only person you're willing to ask. You could get a job, Michael. A real job, not consulting work or business ventures or any of the other fantasy careers you've pursued. You could downsize your lifestyle, sell the house you can't afford, drive a car that costs less than most people's annual salary. You want me to become ordinary? I want you to become self-sufficient. Same thing. The response revealed everything Josephine needed to understand about her son's worldview. In Michael's mind, ordinary people were beneath consideration, and self-sufficiency was a form of failure. He would rather destroy his own mother than accept a life that didn't meet his inflated expectations. Michael, I want you to listen to me very carefully. If you proceed with this competency hearing, if you continue to use my identity fraudulently, if you contact me again with threats or demands, I will press criminal charges against you. I will testify against you in court. I will use every resource at my disposal to make sure you face the full consequences of your actions. His face cycled through disbelief, hurt, and finally a kind of cold hatred that she'd never seen from him before. You would really do that? You would really send your own son to prison? I would really protect myself from someone who's trying to destroy my life, regardless of whether that person happens to be related to me. Michael stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him calculating, weighing his options, trying to find some angle that might still give him what he wanted. Finally, he seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him all at once. I don't know how to be the person you want me to be, he said quietly. And for the first time in months, his voice carried genuine vulnerability rather than manipulation. I don't want you to be anyone other than who you are, Michael. But I want you to be that person honestly, without expecting other people to pay for your choices or solve your problems. And if I can't do that, then you'll face the consequences. And maybe facing those consequences will teach you something that 25 years of being rescued never could. He left without another word, taking the roses with him and leaving Josephine alone with the legal documents that would force her to prove her own competency to a judge. But for the first time since this crisis began, she felt something that had been missing for weeks: clarity. She knew who her son really was now. She knew what he was capable of, what he was willing to do to avoid facing reality. And she knew that loving him, truly loving him, meant refusing to enable his destructive patterns, even if that refusal came at the cost of their relationship. The little boy who had once brought her dandelions was gone, perhaps had never really existed outside her hopeful imagination. In his place was a man who needed to learn lessons that could only be taught through experience, consequence, and the kind of reality that no amount of money could cushion. As she prepared for the legal battle ahead, Josephine David felt a strange sense of peace. She had finally stopped trying to save her son from himself. Now she would focus on saving herself from him. The price of independence. 6 months after the competency hearing that had nearly destroyed her life, Josephine David stood in the same kitchen where this crisis had begun, watching the early spring snow dust her garden with unexpected beauty. The legal battle was over. Michael's petition had been dismissed with prejudice after Amanda's attorney presented evidence of his fraud, harassment, and financial manipulation. The judge had been so appalled by Michael's behavior that she'd issued a restraining order and referred the case to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution. But victory, Josephine had learned, was a more complex thing than she'd expected. The phone rang, interrupting her morning contemplation. Lily's name appeared on the caller ID, and Josephine felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that had accompanied every call from her daughter over the past months. Their relationship remained strained, caught between Lily's professional understanding of enabling behavior and her emotional desire for family harmony. "Good morning, sweetheart." "Hi, Mom." Lily's voice carried a careful neutrality that had become their standard mode of communication. "I wanted to let you know that I saw Michael yesterday." Josephine's grip tightened on the phone. "How is he different?" "Working at that construction company, the one Robert Jr.'s friend owns. He looked tired but healthier somehow, like he'd been sleeping and eating regularly." The news should have brought relief. But instead, Josephine felt a complex mix of emotions she couldn't easily categorize. Relief that Michael was employed, yes, but also a strange sadness that it had taken the threat of criminal prosecution to motivate him toward basic self-sufficiency. "Did he mention me?"
No.
Lily's voice was gentle but honest. He asked about you indirectly, how you were doing, whether you were still living alone, but he didn't ask me to pass along any messages. 6 months of silence, no calls, no texts, no acknowledgement of birthdays or holidays. Michael had made good on his threat to cut contact, though not for the reasons he'd originally claimed. The restraining order made communication legally complicated. But beyond that, Josephine suspected that his pride couldn't tolerate the reality of what he'd become in trying to access her money. "How do you feel about seeing him?" Josephine asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Conflicted, Lily's professional composure cracked slightly. "Part of me was happy to see him functioning independently, but part of me was angry that it took a near-criminal breakdown for him to get there. And part of me was just past sad. Sad that our family got to this point." "I'm sad, too," Josephine admitted. "Every day. Do you regret your decision?" The question Josephine had asked herself countless times over the past 6 months. The answer had evolved through several stages, from certainty to doubt to a kind of resigned acceptance that she was still learning to live with. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I enabled him for so long that saying no felt like abandonment to him. I regret that he chose to respond with fraud and legal threats instead of self-reflection." She paused, watching a cardinal land on her bird feeder. "But I don't regret refusing to pay for his divorce. I think that was the right choice. Even though the consequences were more severe than I anticipated. Even though it cost you your relationship with him. Even though. Because the relationship we had wasn't real, Lily. It was based on transaction, not genuine love. He loved what I could provide for him. I loved the version of him that existed when I was solving his problems. Neither of us loved the actual person." Lily was quiet for a moment, and Josephine could picture her in her therapy office processing the statement through both her professional and personal lenses. "That's very sad, Mom." "It is, but it's also honest. And maybe honesty was something our family needed, even if it came at a high cost." After Lily hung up, Josephine found herself thinking about the community response to Michael's legal defeat. The social ostracism she'd experienced during his campaign had reversed almost completely once the details of the competency hearing became public. Patricia Hartwell had personally apologized for the Bridge Club's treatment of her. Margaret Chun had brought flowers and spent an afternoon expressing her shame at having been so easily manipulated. But the vindication felt hollow. She had been right about Michael's dependency, right about the need for boundaries, right about the dangers of enabling, but being right hadn't prevented the destruction of her family, hadn't saved her son from his worst impulses, hadn't created the healing she'd hoped might eventually emerge from tough love. The doorbell interrupted her brooding. Through the peephole, she could see a young woman she didn't immediately recognize, perhaps 30 years old, professionally dressed, with an expression of nervous determination. "Mrs. David, my name is Sarah Collins. I got your number from Dr. Marcus Williams. I hope you don't mind me coming by unannounced, but I was hoping I could talk to you about what you went through with your son." Josephine invited Sarah in, settling her in the living room with tea and the instinctive hospitality that had been ingrained through decades of entertaining business clients and family friends. "Dr. Williams said you might understand my situation," Sarah began, her hands trembling slightly around her teacup. "My brother is 38 years old, and he's been asking my parents for money for his entire adult life. Business investments, emergency loans, help with rent. It never stops. And now he's pressuring them to refinance their house to give him money for another startup." The familiar pattern made Josephine's chest tight with recognition. "And your parents want to help him. They think they're being good parents. They keep saying that family helps family, that they have resources and he needs them. But I can see what it's doing to him. He's never developed any real professional skills because he's always known they'll bail him out. And it's doing something to them, too. They're stressed all the time, arguing about money, aging faster than they should." "What does your brother say when you raise concerns?" "That I'm jealous because they love him more than me. That I'm trying to poison them against him because I don't want to share their inheritance." Sarah's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting a losing battle for years. "The worst part is sometimes I wonder if he's right. Maybe I am being selfish." Josephine studied the young woman's face and saw her own doubts reflected back at her. the terrible uncertainty that came with challenging family patterns that everyone else accepted as normal. Sarah, can I ask you something? When your brother comes to your parents with these requests, how does he present them? As emergencies? As once-in-a-lifetime opportunities? As situations where their help will make all the difference? Sarah's expression grew bitter, and they believe him every time, even though they've heard the same speech dozens of times before. And after they help him, he disappears for a while until the next crisis. Josephine nodded, recognizing the cycle that had defined her relationship with Michael for decades. Sarah, I want to tell you something that took me 72 years to understand. Enabling someone isn't love. It's fear. Fear that they can't handle life without us. Fear that we'll lose them if we don't solve their problems. Fear that saying no makes us bad people. But what if you're wrong? What if they really can't handle it without help? Then you learn something important about who they are. And they learn something important about who they need to become. Sarah stayed for 2 hours, asking questions that forced Josephine to examine her own choices from new angles. How had she found the courage to say no? How had she handled the community pressure? How did she live with the consequences of her decision? The hardest part, Josephine found herself saying, is accepting that love sometimes looks like abandonment to the person you're trying to help. Michael experienced my refusal as rejection, as proof that I didn't care about him. But continuing to enable him would have been the real rejection, a rejection of his potential to grow, to change, to become someone capable of taking care of himself. Do you think he'll ever understand that? I don't know. I hope so. But my job isn't to make him understand. It's to live with integrity according to what I believe is right, regardless of whether he agrees with my choices. After Sarah left, Josephine realized that their conversation had crystallized something she'd been struggling to articulate about her experience. The past 6 months hadn't been about winning or losing, about being right or wrong. They'd been about choosing authenticity over comfort, honesty over harmony, long-term love over short-term peace. She thought about Michael working construction, earning his own paycheck for probably the first time in his adult life. The image brought her no satisfaction. She would have preferred to see him thriving in a career that utilized his intelligence and education. But there was something valuable in the picture of him learning to support himself, developing calluses and muscle memory, and the deep satisfaction that came from earning rather than receiving. Perhaps this was what Marcus Williams had meant when he talked about believing in someone's capacity to grow. Not the naive belief that everything would work out perfectly, but the harder faith that people were capable of more than their worst behavior suggested. As evening approached, Josephine found herself in Robert's study, looking through photo albums that chronicled decades of family history. Pictures of Michael as a child, grinning gap-toothed at birthday parties and Christmas mornings, photos from his graduations, his weddings, his brief moments of genuine success. The visual record of a life that had been full of potential, promise, and gradually increasing dependence. But scattered throughout the albums were also pictures of Lily. Lily at her college graduation, at her wedding, at the opening of her therapy practice. Pictures of a young woman who had faced challenges, made mistakes, and learned to solve her own problems. The contrast was stark, and for the first time, Josephine could see clearly how different parenting approaches had produced different outcomes. Her phone buzzed with a text message. The number wasn't in her contacts, but something about the area code made her heart race. "Mom, this is Michael. I know I'm not supposed to contact you, but I wanted you to know I'm okay. I have a job and an apartment. I'm paying my own bills. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know." Josephine stared at the message for a long time, reading and rereading the words that carried more weight than their simple content suggested. Michael was working. Michael was paying his own bills. Michael wasn't asking for anything. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't the happy ending she'd once hoped their story might have. But it was something, acknowledgement that growth was possible. That change could happen. That the foundation for a different kind of relationship might someday be built. She typed and deleted several responses before settling on something simple. "I'm glad you're taking care of yourself. I love you." The response came quickly. "I know you do. That's why you did what you did." 6 months after the worst crisis of their relationship, Michael had finally understood what she'd been trying to teach him. The lesson had cost them both more than either had expected to pay. But perhaps some lessons could only be learned at that price. As spring settled over Minneapolis, Josephine David began to believe that independence, both hers and her son's, might be worth what it had cost them to achieve. 1 year to the day after Michael had first demanded she pay for his divorce, Josephine David sat in a small cafe in downtown Minneapolis, waiting for her son. The meeting had been arranged through Lily, who had served as a cautious intermediary for the past 3 months, as Michael completed his court-mandated therapy and worked toward having the restraining order modified. The man who walked through the cafe door looked like Michael, but carried himself differently. His clothes were clean but inexpensive work pants and a flannel shirt that bore the honest wear of manual labor. His hands, when he pulled off his gloves, showed calluses and small scars that spoke of months spent learning skills that had nothing to do with charm or manipulation. "Mom," he said simply, settling into the chair across from her with none of his old swagger. "Michael." She studied his face, noting the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. The way his shoulders sat differently, less entitled, more settled. "You look well." "I feel different." He ordered black coffee when the waitress came by, a far cry from the elaborate drink preferences she remembered. "I wanted to thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know I don't have the right to ask for your time." The form of politeness felt strange coming from someone who had once treated her home like his personal treasury. But Josephine recognized it as growth rather than distance. "How is work?"
Hard. Good.
"I'm learning things I never thought I'd need to know. How to frame a wall. How to read electrical schematics. How to show up every day, even when I don't feel like it." He smiled, and for the first time in years, the expression seemed genuine rather than calculated. "My supervisor says I might make crew chief someday, if I keep learning." "That's wonderful. It's not the life I thought I wanted, but it's a life I've earned. That matters more than I expected it to." They talked carefully for an hour, navigating topics that felt safe: his apartment, her garden, Lily's growing therapy practice. But finally, Michael set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. "I need to say something, and I don't know if I'll have the courage to say it again." He took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, not just for the legal stuff, though that was inexcusable. I'm sorry for 25 years of treating you like an ATM instead of a person. I'm sorry for never asking about your dreams, your fears, your life outside of what you could do for me." The apology landed with unexpected weight. Josephine had prepared herself for many possible versions of this conversation, but not for this level of self-awareness. "I'm sorry too," she said quietly, "for enabling you, for being so afraid of losing you that I never let you learn to stand on your own, for confusing helping with loving. You were trying to be a good mother. I was trying to be a perfect mother. There's a difference." She reached across the table and touched his scarred hand briefly. "Perfect mothers don't raise children who are prepared for real life." Michael nodded, understanding passing between them that felt deeper than any conversation they'd shared in decades. "The therapist I've been seeing, Dr. Rodriguez, she helped me understand something. She said that dependency isn't really about money. It's about fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of failing. Fear of discovering that you're ordinary after all. And what did you discover? That ordinary is enough. That paying my own rent and buying my own groceries and solving my own problems doesn't make me less valuable as a person. It makes me more real." Josephine felt tears starting, a mixture of grief for the years they'd lost and hope for what they might still build. "I always believed you were capable of more than you were showing me. I just didn't know how to help you find it. You found the only way that worked. You stopped helping me avoid it." As they prepared to leave, Michael pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "I wanted to give you something. Not because I owe you anything, but because I wanted to." Inside was a simple wooden jewelry box, roughly made, but carefully sanded and finished. "I made it in the workshop at my apartment complex. It's not perfect, but I made it with my own hands for the first time in my life." Josephine turned the box over in her hands, feeling the slight imperfections that spoke of learning rather than expertise. It was more precious to her than any expensive gift he'd ever bought with her money. It's beautiful. It's honest, he corrected gently. That's something I'm still learning how to be. As they stood to leave, Michael hesitated. Would it be all right if I called you sometimes? Not for help, just to talk. I'd like to know you as a person, not just as someone who could solve my problems. I'd like that very much. They parted with a careful hug, both of them aware that this was a beginning rather than a return to what they'd had before. The relationship they were building would be different, built on mutual respect rather than dependency, honesty rather than transaction, love rather than need. Walking back to her car, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The cost had been enormous. A year of family fracture, social ostracism, legal battles, and the painful destruction of comfortable illusions. But what they'd gained felt equally significant: authenticity, self-respect, and the possibility of a relationship based on who they actually were rather than who they pretended to be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Collins, the young woman who'd visited her months earlier, seeking advice about her brother's dependency. Update: my parents said no to the house refinancing. It's been hard, but they're standing firm. Thank you for showing me it was possible. Josephine smiled, realizing that her story with Michael had become something larger, a template for other families trapped in patterns of enabling and dependency. The painful lessons she'd learned were rippling outward, helping others find the courage to choose difficult love over easy enabling. As she drove through the streets of Minneapolis toward the home she'd worked so hard to secure, Josephine David felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine peace. Not the false peace of avoiding conflict, but the deeper satisfaction that came from living according to her values regardless of the cost. She thought about Michael in his small apartment, learning to cook for himself, managing his own budget, solving his own problems. The image brought her more joy than any of his previous successes had, because this achievement was entirely his own. The price of independence had been higher than either of them had imagined. But as she pulled into her driveway and saw the early evening light painting her garden gold, Josephine knew it had been worth every difficult moment. They were both free now, free from the toxic patterns that had bound them, free to discover who they were when they weren't locked in the dance of enabler and dependent. For the first time in decades, the future felt full of possibility rather than obligation. And that, Josephine realized, was the greatest gift she could have given both of them. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.